There's some cliches that we embrace as a society, not necessarily because they always feel true, but because they often do have that smattering of comfort to us. Maybe it's a way to protect ourselves from harm, you know? We have some ideas that we embrace as I think as a bit of armoring, you know? These expressions that we put on to gird ourselves up, to try to protect ourselves from being hurt. One of those things is this sentiment that people don't change. People don't change. Why are you so mad at your boss? Your boss is always acting like your boss always acts. Oh, you're expecting your spouse to do something different? Well, it seems to me like they're acting like they always do. People don't change. We never say it about positive aspects of a person, right? We're never like, people don't change. Nikki's always going to be a fantastic musician, right? No, we say it like people don't change. Giuseppe's always going to be kind of a little bit of a know-it-all, you know? We just got to expect it. But our story today reminds us that people can and do change. In fact, we're always changing. Even those of us who try so hard to stay in one place, by that very action, are changing. That's part of why trying to conserve a moment in time is always a deceit. Some of you know this. If you've spent enough time looking in the mirror, you start noticing things changing on your face. You're like, you know what, I'm going to buy that right product, and I'm going to freeze this in time. I'm going to keep this from changing. And yet change seems to move forward and happen anyway. The question is, what are we changing as? Are we changing for the better? Can people change for the better? And this is the hope of the book of Acts, one of the hopes of this book. For those of you who may not be familiar, the book of Acts is a continuation of what's going on with the disciples after they've been with Jesus and now he's gone to heaven. So we've passed this crux, this turning point where the church was starting to take hold amongst different people groups. It wasn't just Jewish people who were in Jerusalem, it was spreading. Part of the catalyst for the spread are awful persecution that's happening for Jesus followers within this tiny group of Jewish religion practitioners at the time. This isn't Christianity as we think of it yet. This is a specific version of the Jewish religion following Jesus. Okay? So we've got some nuance happening. We've got some change happening. And one of those changes is Samaritans, longtime enemies of the Jewish people and Jewish followers of Christ, becoming friends. A change that might have seemed impossible beforehand. Today's story has a similar idea of enemies becoming friends. And for it, we're looking at Saul. This is the same person that ends up later writing most of, being given credit for, we'll say, most of the letters in the New Testament. We know for sure he wrote 7. We can't claim all of the ones that carry his name were by him, but 7 we're pretty confident on. And you might be thinking, I don't know any Saul who wrote letters. Well, Saul is his Hebrew name. Paul is his Greek name, the name he went by amongst the Roman Empire, outside of his synagogues. Now, Saul, we meet 2 chapters earlier. Stephen, the first martyr, is being stoned to death. And Saul, we're told, is standing on the sidelines holding people's coats as they engage in this lynching that's happening. Saul is a Pharisee. Now, we often think, oh, Pharisee, that must mean he's a bad person. He's a hypocrite. That's not what ancient people reading these letters would have thought, or the book of Acts would have thought. Because the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the synagogues. And yeah, some of them were not the best, just like many of our pastors in Christian churches are not the best. But many of them were doing fantastic stuff, trying to share the religious practices of the Jewish community outside of the temple, outside of Jerusalem. They're helping their people continue on in a lot of ways. We lose sight of that because Jesus is constantly butting heads with Pharisees. But Jesus was also a rabbi, and this is something that rabbis would often do. The Pharisees also squabbled with each other because many of our teachers disagree on some minutia, right? I just went to Comic-Con yesterday and the day before. We love to nerd out on stuff. We dive deep into stuff. But there was this one panel that happened. It was called Useless Debates. You dive deep enough into any subject matter, and eventually you're going to get some opinions. You're going to disagree on these things. Now, those points of disagreement, I think, are important in our scriptures. But I don't want us to jump straight to, like, Paul must be, a horrible, lousy person because he's a Pharisee. That's not what we're told the problem is. The problem is that he is trying to conserve his tradition at all cost. He's trying to keep it in one place. He's trying to keep it from deviation. Saul is a fantastically passionate person, and he's a religious purist, and so he sees Jesus followers as a deviation. And he wants to, batten down the hatches on this. His hope is, if I can arrest and detain these Jesus followers, and perhaps if we murder a few of them, well, this heresy will stop happening. So he goes over to the high priest, somebody who's amongst the Sadducees. They're the religious elite. These groups do not always get along very well. The Pharisees are like the thought leaders, and the Sadducees are like the religious political leaders. And he gets permission from the high priest to leave Jerusalem, where all this persecution is happening, to go into some of the surrounding towns, to go further and further out and get those nasty, nasty Jesus followers. And he goes out on his way. And he's gained enough of a reputation at this point that Jesus followers know his name and they fear him. And he gets this entourage. Really, they're his enforcers. And they set out for the town of Damascus. And they're on their way. And suddenly there is this blinding light, and Saul is on the ground, knocked over. He can't see anything, and he hears a voice. And this is what Todd read a moment ago. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And Saul responds, who are you, sir? And the voice replies, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. I love this because it tells us something about how our writer in Acts sees Jesus, and by extension, how we can see God. Jesus is always kind of this funnel for displaying how God is, right? And he doesn't say, Saul, why did you help murder Stephen? He doesn't say, Saul, why are you persecuting my followers? He says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? That matters. Because I think too many of us, when we're suffering, feel like we're just all on our own in this. And here our writer's telling us, actually, God takes that personally. When you're suffering, God takes that personally. God is bearing that with you. You're not going through it by yourself. I need to keep hearing that. Because there's too many times I do feel like I'm all alone. So Saul hears this. And for him, this is not necessarily like a comforting thought. Because think about the other side. That means that when we're engaging in harm of someone else, we're not just harming that person. We're not just harming Mimi. We're harming the God who's always with Mimi. So he tells Saul, go into Damascus, and I want you to await further orders. And so his muscle then go from being like his enforcers, they're going to go bang some heads, they're going to go capture some Jesus followers, maybe some of them will die, maybe some of them won't, to guiding him into town. They have to take him by the hands or put him on his donkey and lead him into town. And he stays in this house for 3 days, and we're told he doesn't eat or drink anything during that time. And so our minds go to like, well, he must be fasting and praying. But that's a lot of time to be by yourself, not able to see anything. If I had 3 days in a house and I wasn't able to see my cell phone, I think I would go stir crazy. It doesn't matter how much praying I'm doing. After a while, I'm going to get a little bored, I'm going to probably have to go to some deep places. So I anticipate Saul is going into some deep places. I wonder, during those 3 days, is he coming to terms with the harm that he's been perpetuating? Is he realizing, I've been wrong? I've hurt people, and I've been wrong. I think he must be going through this kind of brewing dark night of the soul that so many of us have to go through in our hard, crushing moments as a catalyst to something better that comes after. Those moments of transformation where maybe we realize we've been wrong on something, and maybe we're a bit mad about it. Mad at ourselves, maybe mad at God, mad at our companions. I read a book early in my deconstruction called A New Kind of Christian by Brian McLaren, who also went through a deconstruction from being much more conservative to being more progressive. And he has this character in it who starts learning a better way to carry his faith forward after he's been confronted by some hard truths by his friends, Neo. And at one point, he's screaming at Neo. He's just so mad because his world is unraveling. His commitments are kind of being undone. Sometimes that has to happen for something better to come along. I think that's why so many of us who've been on a journey like mine call it deconstruction. I happen to be so far into it that I've reconstructed plenty, and I'm grateful for that. And some of those things will continue to deconstruct and reconstruct, because growth is good. But I remember how I've gone through my own moments of immense terror and fear and sadness when I've realized I was on the wrong side of something. When I was hurting people near and dear to the heart of the God that I thought I was serving. At one point, I was in seminary. It shouldn't have taken me this long. It's maybe 3 or 4 years into my deconstruction journey. I realized I had this huge barrier in front of me. I needed to apologize to my previous students from when I was a youth pastor who were LGBTQIA+. And so I set out writing letters, and if I couldn't find their addresses, then writing emails. Some of them, it was Facebook messaging. It's back when I still had Facebook. It was a dumpster fire, but not as much as it is now. I made some phone calls. It was so hard. One of the hardest parts, though, was hearing folks' response to that, saying, well, I forgive you. Some of them gave me plenty of excuses and wiggle room, like, hey, look, hey, it's not that bad. I know you cared about me. And like, I was still trying to extinguish this part of yourself. And I'm sorry for that. Paul goes through his own kind of reconciliation here. His blindness after 3 days comes to an end when he and this other gentleman named Ananias receive these parallel visions. Sometimes we need to receive a vision in order for reconciliation to happen. Sometimes we need a little bit of divine nudging. Hey, go say you're sorry. Hey, maybe you need to learn a few things. Stop thinking you know everything. And Ananias, one of these individuals that Saul would have hunted, arrested, and perhaps seen put to death, is led by God's Spirit, nudged by the Spirit to go over to Saul and lay his hands on him. Now, if that was me, and I was in this vulnerable situation of that Ananias is in, I don't know how gentle I would have been. I think I would have at least given him like a stern talking to, Maybe I wouldn't have washed my hands before I put them on him. I don't know. Something passive-aggressive. But Ananias approaches him with the language of family. And he says, Saul, my brother, receive your sight. And the scales fall from Saul's eyes. We're told that in the days and weeks and months that come from this, people are terrified of Saul, and with good reason, but they start building relationship with him, and he builds relationship with them. He goes from being a rabbi, a Pharisee, an expert, a religious leader, to now he's learning with everybody else. He's going through his own deconstruction as this group provides him space. And eventually one of them, Barnabas, who we met weeks and weeks ago, becomes his friend and his advocate. You ever see How I Met Your Mother? He does like the Barney, like, have you met Saul? 3 of you saw it, good. And eventually, Saul starts getting in hot water too, from the same folks who were his friends before, the same folks that were a part of his group that he's left. And they seek to murder him. And it's the church, these Christians, before they were called Christians, these Jesus followers that he sought to murder, who save his life. This is not just a story about Saul becoming the Apostle Paul. This is a story of reconciliation. This is a story about community, being community where it matters. Paul throwing in his lot with the group he was hurting, and that same group throwing their lot in with him. It's a story of reconciliation. And it reminds us that people can and do change. Jesus in the Gospels, in Matthew and Luke, says, pray for those who persecute you and love your enemies. And sometimes that's the absolutely hardest thing to do. But I believe there can be good fruit that comes from it. Because I've seen it, and I've experienced it, just like many of you in this room have. People can change. So let's pray for those who seek to do us harm, if we can. Let's seek to love them how we can. And at the same time, let's not lose sight of the scales we may be carrying in our own eyes. We have not arrived yet either. There may be ways that we still continue to harm people. Let's see if we can find those and change and grow. Because none of us get to just stand still on this journey of life. We're always moving forward.